So, after visiting Rome, our next destination was Florence, which is the heart of the Italian Renaissance. We were really looking forward to visiting this city because this is the city where all of the intellectual thinkers of the Middle Ages they were trying to give birth to their ideas through art and culture. So we arrived in Florence by train. It was a fairly straightforward train ride from Termini station in Rome. We were not able to take a lot of videos inside the train because there was another passenger sitting next to us. But overall, it was a very scenic view. We'll probably add in a few pictures of the train here that you can see. There were some really nice museums which we had booked over in Florence, especially the Academia and the Uffizi, which we were really looking forward to because it had all of the great works from all of these great artists. In hindsight, I do, however, think that there are a few things which we could have done better to process all of that information, which I will talk about later. We decided to spend the first evening doing a street walk, and we noticed that there were quite a few small nice shops, although most of them were quite touristy. We did come across a few local thrift shops, and they were selling artistic items like paintings, jewelry, and clothing. So this seemed to be a really popular sandwich place. We couldn't try the sandwich here, but it seemed like it's really good. So we now arrive at one of the historic monuments of Florence, the Basilica of Santa Croce. The beautiful detail on the outside of the church really captivates us. This church is the burial place of many important Italians like Michelangelo, Galileo, and Machiavelli. We do see a statue of Dante in front of the church, but Dante's body is actually not buried here. It's believed that because Dante had published a few books where he was criticizing the city of Florence, the Florence government refused to accept his body when he passed away. So this is probably one of the most recognizable buildings in the world, the Cathedral of Santa Maria, or also referred to as El Duomo, the actual symbol of the Renaissance. The construction of this building, or the church rather, began in the 1200s. The building that stood here before the construction of the Santa Maria was beginning to crumble, and at the time, the city council decided to give the commission of the new church to the same architect who had designed the Santa Croce. The Santa Maria church was supposed to have a really gigantic dome, but unfortunately, before the dome was constructed, the architect died. And for about 200 years or so, nobody knew how to construct the dome. So the Santa Maria lied there with its roof all open. The construction of the dome was finally completed in the 1400s by a different architect who had devised another way to essentially design a standing dome. This building is essentially what made Florence what it is, which was a hotspot for artists and intellectuals from all over Italy and possibly even Europe to come gather around and basically practice their own art. This is the city center in Florence, and just a few hundred meters away is the Piazza del Signora, which is sort of like a town hall here. The statue of David is an icon in the artistic world for his lifelike anatomy. Carved to perfection and probably one of the most recognized art forms in the world,
It's one of the key attractions which draw people to Florence. But there is so much more to this statue because it took the Cathedral Commission more than 200 years to get this right. The year is 1296, and the Republic of Florence decided to create a committee called the Opera del Duomo to oversee the constructions of cathedrals and artistic monuments and statues throughout the city. In 1463, they sanctioned an artist called Agostino to build one of the heroes of the Old Testament, and they gave him about 12,000 pounds of marble from this area called Carrata in Tuscany. Unfortunately, Agostino wasn't able to build this, so a few years later they passed it on to another artist, Antonio. Unfortunately, Antonio couldn't build it either because he said that the marble has already been used by somebody else and he can't use it anymore. In 1501, a 26-year-old Michelangelo would be presented with this challenge, and he would spend the next 3 years of his life sculpting what two other artists could not do and what would become an iconic sculpture. What he envisioned was a young David from the Old Testament looking at Goliath before he would go into battle with him.